What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV, and in this video, it's going to be a second part of the six-part series ranking the Chicago Bulls dynasty. Of course, number six, I had the 1997-98 Chicago Bulls. All right, I thought they were overall the weakest team of the six-time NBA championship uh, teams of the 90s. At number five, I went ahead and went with the 1992-93 Chicago Bulls. Um, I just think that, in essence, they're like matching bookends of the two three peats, the '93 team and the '98 team. All right, and they had similar weaknesses. Um, I think even though statistically the '98 team had a weaker bench statistically, excuse me. I think when you actually look at the '93 team, though, their bench might even be weaker. I mean, let's look at something here. Got to remember the late '90s, excuse me, '98. Scoring was down across the league anyway. So in '93, the numbers will be a little bit inflated. But let's look at their bench. Now Scott Williams was a solid role player, solid bench player. Okay, brought energy. All right, brought rebounding. But let's look at their team. Let's look at this team. Corey Williams, who I don't think was on the playoff roster. Darrell Walker, great defensive player. Trent Tucker, great outside shooter, especially with New York Knicks. But by the time he got with the Bulls, his best days were over. Will Perdue, pretty solid. I liked him. Ed Neely, Rodney McCray, Stacey King, disappointment. I don't really remember JoJo English being on the team. Um, Joe Courtney wasn't on the playoff roster. Ricky Blanton, don't remember him being on the playoff roster. That's about it. I think talent wise, the '93 Bulls had the weakest bench. Statistically, it's the '98 team. Um, so that was one weakness the '93 Bulls had to deal with was the starters had to step up like the '98 team did and sort of take up the slack for the bench. Um, and that kind of proved true during the season. I remember many games where if Jordan and Pippen weren't on the floor, the Bulls would surrender some leads. I mean, look who had gone from the team. Craig Hodges was blackballed from the league. We all know that. Bobby Hansen was gone, the hero of the '92 finals. Who else was gone? uh, Cliff Levingston. Cliff Levingston was no longer with the team. John Paxson, the former starting point guard, had diminished physically to the point where he now came off the bench. And B.J. Armstrong, who had been a bench player, stepped up and became the starter eventually with the Chicago Bulls. And he did a fine job. He did a great job at the starting position. I think that in the in the championship era, I think that offensively he was the best point guard we've ever had. Uh, Ron Harper was a big point guard, great defensively for the later Chicago Bulls teams, but he wasn't a shooter, and he wasn't the scorer that he had been before his injuries. Um, so that was one weakness for that team. Another thing that affected the team was overall fatigue. Got to remember the Chicago Bulls have been playing deep in the playoffs and NBA Finals for a couple of years now. In '90, they made it all the way to the Eastern Conference Finals. In 91, of course, they won the championship. In 92, they won the championship. So you're playing 15 to 20 extra games every year, all right, for 3 years straight. And then in 92, of course, you had Barcelona, which Scottie Pippen and Michael Jordan were members of the Dream Team. That was an awesome experience. I know it had to be awesome for those two guys. It was great to have for America, to have a Olympic team that we could take pride in. Of course, prior to that season, professionals had been barred from the Olympics. That ban was lifted, and of course, we had the Dream Team, and they kicked ass. But those are a lot of extra games for these guys. And, while Pippen and Jordan were still young, Pippen came into the season, I think he was 20, how was Pippen then? 27, and was in his prime years. Matter of fact, I think Scottie Pippen's best years were from 92 to 96. That was Pippen's prime. And he was just entering his prime. Michael Jordan came into the season 29. He turned 30 on February 17th, 1993. And this was the first year that we could see signs that Michael was starting to decline a little bit physically, athletically. He was still a dominant, great player, but he was a less high-flying, he was a less high-flying Baryshnikov and more of a grounded jump shooter at that time. He was starting to transition into becoming what we would say fadeaway Jordan. You know, um, Matter of fact, when I think about it, aside from that those dunks that he had on Morning during that year, and maybe into the playoffs, I really don't remember any memorable dunks from him that year. And what else I want to say about the team? Bill Cartwright was clearly diminishing as a player as well. Uh, that season, he came into the season 35 years old. He turned 36, I think, later that season. And he was nearing the end of his run as an NBA player. The Chicago Bulls that year, they played well, um, but they didn't dominate the way they had in the past. And they wound up with a 57-25 record, which is the worst record they've ever achieved during any of their three-peat or their six championship teams. And there was a lot of talk about two teams that particular season. The Phoenix Suns, they had just acquired Charles Barkley via trade from the Philadelphia 76ers. And the New York Knicks. You have to go back into this year. Now, let's go back in time and let's take all of what happened since then out of the equation and go back into this particular season. We have to remember that the year before this, all right, in the 1992 playoffs, the New York Knicks unexpectedly presented a grave challenge to the Chicago Bulls championship aspirations that year. They forced the Bulls to 7 games. They were the only team other than the 1998 Indiana Pacers to force the Chicago Bulls to a seventh game during the championship seasons. Some people even feel like that game 7 might have been rigged by the officials. Um, but the next year, the New York Knicks took a step up. All right. Um, they won 60 ball games. And overall, to be honest with you, talent for talent, the New York Knicks were a better overall team than the Chicago Bulls, as were the Phoenix Suns, of course, now being led by Charles Barkley. Both of these teams presented a tremendous challenge to the Chicago Bulls. And to focus on the Knicks for a second, the Knicks now, in 92, 93 were overall the best regular season team in the Eastern Conference. They won 60 games, which tied a franchise record, which was set by one of the championship Knicks teams from the 70s. I think it was the 72-73 Knicks that won 60 games. Of course, I know Chris Jr. or Scorpio will fact check me on that one. Uh, Many people thought that this would be the year the Knicks would surpass the Chicago Bulls. They looked at the fact that it would be Pat Riley. Pat Riley was coaching the Chicago Bulls. I mean, excuse me, Pat Riley was coaching. He wished he was. Pat Riley was coaching the New York Knicks. All right. Pat Riley, at that time, was seen as the best coach in the NBA. Of course, he had coached the Showtime Lakers. And what he was able to do with the Knicks, a team with a totally different offensive philosophy, a totally different overall team philosophy, um, to go from the Lakers to the Knicks and to have a similar level of success, it was astounding. And many people looked at it like this: well, look, the Pistons lost to the Celtics before they learned how to win. And then the Chicago Bulls lost to the Pistons before they learned how to win. The Knicks have been losing to the Bulls for years. Now they learn how to win. And many people thought that'd be the year that the Knicks would overtake the Chicago Bulls. Then, of course, you had the Phoenix Suns. And many people looked at the Phoenix Suns as the best overall team in the NBA. They won 62 games that year. Charles Barkley would go on to win the MVP award. Some people feel like Charles Barkley should have won the MVP award in 89-90. I think he should have. All right. Charles Barkley himself would tell you at that time that he was the best player in the NBA. Both of these teams were more dominant during the regular season than the Chicago Bulls. So you go into the playoffs with two teams in particular that looked like they were primed to, one way or the other, dethrone the Chicago Bulls as the best team in the NBA. Now, in the first round, the Chicago Bulls played the Atlanta Hawks. Atlanta Hawks weren't really a good team. Uh, their heyday for that particular team was in the 80s. They had Dominique Wilkins, the human highlight reel. That probably was the last great year Dominique had. That 93-94 was a good year. So they ended up trading him to the Clippers. He had a good year. But I mean, like, monster year, that was it. He averaged 29.9 points per game. He successfully came back from uh, the Achilles injury that he had suffered. And I think he's the first pro athlete to really come back from that type of injury. Now, but other than Dominique Wilkins, the Atlanta Hawks really didn't have much of anything. That's one of the reasons why the very next year they traded Dominique Wilkins. He was getting old, and it was time for the Atlanta Hawks to move on and rebuild. And the Chicago Bulls swept the Atlanta Hawks 3-0. This is, of course, when the first round was still a best of five affair. And the next round, the Chicago Bulls played the Cleveland Cavaliers. And you have to remember the history of the Cleveland Cavaliers. The Cavaliers were seen back in the late 80s as the team of the future, the team of the 90s. Magic Johnson had proclaimed that club to be the team of the 1990s. You remember they had the nucleus of Brad Daugherty, who unfortunately would retire prematurely in the mid 90s because of back injuries and back issues. You had John Hot Rod Williams, may he rest in peace. You had Larry Nance, the father of Larry Nance Jr. Jr. You had Ron Harper, who, unbeknownst to millions, would eventually become a teammate of Michael Jordan's and be a spearhead of the defense of the late 1990s championship team. But Ron Harper in his prime was a player that many called a poor man's Michael Jordan. And of course, you had Craig Elo come off the bench. And, well, later on, he became a starter. And you had Mark Price, a guy who I think might be one of the most underrated point guards in the history of the NBA. A guy who, until recently, was the greatest free throw shooter in the history of the NBA and one of the great shooters of all time. He still is. But that team was heavily favored in both series, I think in 88 and 89 over the Bulls. That gets lost in history. That's why Jordan's shot was so memorable, because the Bulls were not supposed to beat that team. It was Michael Jordan's overall dominance and greatness which was dragging these Bulls teams to victories. It wasn't that Michael Jordan had loaded teams. I get so tired when the media keeps saying that, because it's a false narrative to prop up a certain guy who I'm not going to name because this video is not about him. But you know what I'm saying. But anyway, the Cleveland Cavaliers have fallen on hard times. But they resurged in 91-92, and they played the Chicago Bulls in 6 games, losing 4 games to 2. But to address the fact that they really had no answer for Michael Jordan, they went out and acquired Gerald Wilkins from the New York Knicks. Gerald Wilkins was the quote-unquote Jordan stopper. He did give Jordan some issues. But you're not going to stop Michael Jeffrey Jordan, all right? You may slow him down on occasion, especially if he's not inspired. But he was inspired in that series, and the Bulls were inspired. The championships had rejuvenated this club, and they beat the hell out of Cleveland pretty much for the first 3 games of that series. Game 4 was close. I remember the last sequence. I remember Jordan backing up Wilkins. I remember Wilkins knocking the ball away from Michael recovering. And I remember Jordan rising up, elevating for a fall-away jumper, a fall-away over Gerald Wilkins, going on net. And I remember him raising his hands in the air. And it was just another signature moment. And the Chicago Bulls would go on to face the New York Knicks. That was the matchup everybody was waiting for. This was like the NBA's version of Ali and Frazier. Was it going to be Ali or was it going to be Frazier? I guess in this scenario, Frazier would be the Knicks. Ali would be Chicago. And during the first 2 games of that series, the Bulls lost. They were down 2-0. And history was not on Chicago's side at all. I think the last team to come back from a 2-0 deficit at that particular time was the 1977 Portland Trailblazers. And as the scene shifted to Chicago Stadium, many people outside of Bull fans and optimists felt like the Bulls dynasty may have been over. But the Chicago Bulls were able to come back and win both games at Chicago Stadium and get back into the series, a series that was tied 2-2. Now, it was Game 5 that was pivotal. Game 5, you have to remember, now I'm going off memory, okay? Sometimes my numbers could be wrong. Like I say, Chris Jr. and Scorpio can fact check me. But if I'm not mistaken, I think the New York Knicks went 37-4 at the Garden that year. They did not lose often there. In fact, I don't think they had lost 2 straight games at home there that season. And they hadn't lost at Madison Square Garden in the playoffs yet. So Game 5 was at the Garden, and it was a close game, and a game that went down to the wire. And it was that last possession by the Knicks that was pivotal. Eventually, during that possession, the ball got into Charles Smith's hands. And Charles Smith appeared to have an easy shot in the basket. But the Chicago Bulls swarmed around him. And you guys might remember this. To Smith. Smith stopped. Smith stripped. Smith stopped. Smith stopped again. Oh, what a play by Scottie Pippen. I remember him getting blocked like 2 or 3 times by Pippen. I think he got blocked once by Jordan. He got blocked by Grant. And I think it was Horace Grant that got the rebound. I think he passed it to Jordan. Jordan saw B.J. Armstrong streaking to the basket. He passed it, like a football pass to B.J. Armstrong. B.J. Armstrong scores at the buzzer. And it was a stunning defeat. It was stunning for Knicks fans. It was stunning because even though technically they were still in the series. It was 3-2 Chicago. Psychologically, most Knicks fans knew that that was it. They knew it. It psychologically took the wind out of their sails. Game 6 at Chicago Stadium was not a blowout, but it was pretty much a mere formality that the Chicago Bulls were going back to the NBA Finals. And that dogged determination, that ability to come back from defeat, to come back from the odds, is what endears people to the Chicago Bulls. All right, not front running shit, and that's what championship teams are made of. But it wasn't over, and they had to go next round. They would have to face a team that many believe was the best team in the NBA, the Phoenix Suns. Now, this was a pretty strange series in a lot of ways, man. Number one, with the exception of one game, that being Game 4 at the Chicago Stadium, no team won any of their home games. This was a road warrior series. All right, for those of you who feel like the NBA is sometimes rigged and always help the home court and the home team, not in this series. um, number two, Phoenix was a very high scoring team. All right, I remember Bruce Bliss did a video recently where he said that the offensive rating for the 1992-93 Phoenix Suns is similar to the offensive rating for the 2017-18 Orlando Golden State Warriors. That goes to show you how dominant a team that was. Charles Barkley, of course, was a great player. I think he averaged something like 25 points and close to 13 rebounds that season, or 12 or 13 rebounds, like 4 assists, 1.5 steals. I think he shot 52% from the floor. He was expanding his overall game to the 3-point line, and he was a great, great player. And of course, you had Kevin Johnson, who, if it were not for injuries, would be a Hall of Fame point guard. You had Dan Marley, a perennial Sixth Man of the Year candidate. You had Cedric Ceballos, a guy who, would normally be a starter. You had Mark West. You had Frank Johnson. You had Tom Chambers, a guy that was a former star with the Sonics and the Suns, and a guy who scored 20,000 points in his career. Coming off the bench, that team was fucking loaded. And when people sit there and say Michael Jordan didn't play against teams that were dominant, what the fuck are you talking about? You have to be a millennial who did not watch these teams or know about these teams. But anyway, the Phoenix Suns lost the first 2 games of that series. And only thing I can say is if you're a Phoenix Suns team, you're like, well, look, the Bulls fell down 2-0. We can come back. And then in Game 3 at Chicago Stadium, they did. They won that game. I think it was an overtime game. I think it went to triple overtime. And Phoenix was able to win that game. I can't remember the exact score, but I think it was 120-something to 120-something. And I remember Michael scoring like 40-some points, but he took like 43 shots. I think he shot like 19 or 43 from the floor. And then in game four, Michael Jordan goes nuts. All right. Michael Jordan scored 33 points, I think, in the first half of that game. He wound up with 55 points on 21-37 shooting from the floor. And Chicago then took a three games to one lead, excuse me. Game five, you know what I'm saying, is at Chicago Stadium. Remember the series at that time was still 2-3-2 format to uh, appease the media as far as travel. You know, the NBA had grown exponentially starting in the 80s, and to accommodate the travel costs, the league switched to a 2-3-2 format. I think that was changed sometime during the 2000s back to a standards format because of social media. You didn't really need that anymore, and the advance in travel as far as technology. But Game Five went to the Phoenix Suns at Chicago, so the scene shifts to Phoenix, and it sounds familiar to '98, right? Chicago's up 3-2. The scene shifts to Phoenix, but if you're Chicago, you're not really daunted by that because you already beaten this team two times in their building. And the scene shifts to Phoenix, and Michael Jordan once again is dominating the Phoenix Suns. Um, he's making 3 pointers. He's driving to the basket. He's shooting fall away jumpers. He's scoring in the post. You know, he's doing it all. And on the defensive end. But the Chicago Bulls go cold in the fourth quarter, and they fall behind. I think it was like 98-94. And I remember Michael Jordan driving the length of the court to get a layup. I think it was 98-96. It was the next sequence which I think haunts Charles Barkley for the rest of his life. Now, Charles Barkley spoke about this. I think it was on court. Charles Barkley gets the ball sometime during the next possession for the Phoenix Suns, and he's double teamed. He's double teamed by Horace Grant and Scottie Pippen. Scottie Pippen's coming over to help out on defense. Now, Scottie Pippen was saying, Charles Barkley was saying at the time that he thought about splitting the defense and trying to go for a bucket himself. But he decided to make the best basketball play, which was a pass to a wide open Dan Marley. That was the best play. Dan Marley was wide open. Had Dan Marley connected, Phoenix would have been up 100 to 96. So even a 3-pointer wouldn't have helped them. Chicago. I remember when Dan Marley got that shot, when he got the pass, my heart sank because I'm like, God damn, he's wide open. Dan Marley proceeded to airball a wide open baseline jumper. It couldn't have been more than 10, maybe 10 feet from the basket, 12 feet. And then the sequence happened on the other end where John Paxson hit the series clinching 3-pointer. Then on the other end, Kevin Johnson got his shot blocked by Horace Grant, and that was it. The Chicago Bulls got their three-peat. They got their three-peat, and they entered the pantheon of great teams in the history of not only just the NBA, but in team sports. Michael Jordan went on average NBA Finals record 41 points per game. Scottie Pippen really stepped up in the playoffs. I think he averaged well over 20 points per game in the playoffs. And Scottie Pippen cemented his overall legacy as not just some second banana, but a great player in his own right. Horace Grant stepped up. All right, B.J. Armstrong really stepped up offensively and hit some clutch shots for this club. And I think when you look at the weakness of that bench and the overall responsibility it took for the starters and the great coaching by Phil Jackson, uh, the Chicago Bulls earned their place in history. But I think overall, I think fifth is about the right spot to put this team. But in the comment section, tell me what you guys think about yourself. What would you rank this team? Would you rank them higher? I think there's some people that might rank them higher for whatever reason. But I think 5th out of 6 is about right. Tell me what you guys think.